thank you all for being here. I'm afraid the bad news is that I could speak for an hour too. However, you know, I'm now well into my 70s and a pensioner, and I've been forced to come to terms with the fact that I'm no longer a spring chicken. In fact, this, I suppose, is my swan song, if you'll forgive me for mixing avian metaphors. And it sort of reminds me of when I went to see a performance by the great French mime artist Marcel Marceau, who was then in his late 80s. And it was positively his last appearance, except that I was living in the United States and he toured the country and did about 100 positively last appearances. So never fear, I shall carry on miming until I eventually fade away. Now, I've been hanging around universities for more than half a century. Indeed, when I started, the Dead Sea was still alive. So I wonder if you would allow me the terrible self-indulgence of recounting a couple of episodes from this before I start on the serious stuff, which does come next. And the first of these episodes was the time when I took a taxi to Kurdistan. It was a 6.5-hour dash across the Zagros Mountains. The tires screamed on the hairpin bends. There was no guardrail. The views were spectacular. We stopped at Hamadan to visit the tomb of Ibn Sina, Latinized as Avicenna, who 1,000 years ago knew much more about science than anyone in Europe did. And eventually we rolled down the hill into Sanandaj, capital of the Kurdish province. The first thing I saw when I got there was a photograph of myself pinned to a lamppost. Look, if you don't believe me, I'll show you a picture of it. But this, in fact, you'll be disappointed to learn, was not a wanted poster. They were simply proud of having a foreigner at the event I was due to attend. I was then met by the rector of the Azad Islamic University and marched off to be measured up. A few hours later, I was presented with a complete set of Kurdish national costume. I was going to wear it tonight, but I chickened out. And it consisted of a pair of trousers wide enough to make a sail for an ocean-going yacht, a jacket so tight that when it was done up, I could hardly breathe, a 4-meter-long muslin sash and a pillbox hat. I was then marched off to a Kurdish cultural evening, which started with the Kurdish National Youth Orchestra playing something slightly obscure by Benjamin Britten. That was followed by an historical reenactment in which a bunch of men shouted, waved swords and banged drums. And it ended with an exact facsimile, perfect in every detail, of the British comedy programme, The Two Ronnies. The only difference with it was that it was recited entirely in the Kurdish language. So I was so zapped by this, I decided that I would get drunk on the local beer. It proved to be rather difficult because it was non-alcoholic and tasted of lemon. And the whole episode ended when I took off from Sanandaj Airport, bound, if I remember rightly, for Kashan, in a museum piece, Fokker 100, which lumbered into the sky and flew low over the lemon-flavoured non-alcoholic beer factory, whence I could rain down curses upon it. The second episode occurred in the Central Andes when I was living on a guinea pig farm. We only ate guinea pig on Sundays, and on Sunday morning, the cook would run around the kitchen with a big stick, and there'd be a lot of squeaking and scuffling. She cut the head off and scraped away at the fur and fried these animals in 3-month-old cottonseed oil. I remember that oil very well because on the Altiplano, there was a fish restaurant. We went and ordered trout. They didn't have any fish, but they did have a stick of dynamite about that long, which they lit and lobbed into the lake. And there was a boom, a fountain of water, and all the fish came up ready to be fried in 3-month-old cottonseed oil. So my job on that particular expedition was to sort out the imprint of the last glaciation with respect to the previous glacial advance. It was interesting work, and I discovered some horrendous cataclysms from the past that I think were totally unknown: gigantic earthquakes, enormous outburst floods, and so on. But to do this, one day I decided I had to go up the side of the mountain, which involved setting off from the guinea pig farm, which was at 3,350 meters above sea level, and climbing up a path which felt vertical, although actually it was angled at 42 degrees. And after 1.5 kilometers, arriving at 4,950 meters above sea level and heaving myself over the side of the shoulder of the valley. The peaks were at 6,000, the altiplano at 5,000. Well, blood was trickling from my knees and my lungs were heaving furiously in a vain attempt to get some oxygen into them. I felt as weak as a kitten as a result, and there in front of me was a llama herder nonchalantly leaping from rock to rock and playing the trumpet as he went. That, of course, was an entirely different metabolism, I suppose. So I set to examining a rock face, and suddenly a shadow fell over me. It was a very large shadow accompanied by a very loud whirring noise. I was being attacked by condors. That was a real Goldilocks situation. In the front, there was Daddy Condor. Behind him, there was Mummy Condor, and bringing up the rear was Baby Condor. Well, whether or not there was any substance in it, I was terrified of being picked up and dropped from a great height. They were enormous birds. So I fought back with the only implement I had, which is a geological hammer, which happened to be the smallest one on the market because I brought practically a child's geological hammer in order to save weight in my luggage. But anyway, they did go away and all was well. The trouble is that condors have been my bête noire for some time. In fact, you can't see it, but in the corner of the room stands a silent condor, which is about 2 meters high. And because condors have really stupid looking faces, being vultures, this one has got the face of David Siqueiros' hideous impaled eagle from that fresco in the presidential palace on the Zocalo in Mexico City. But anyway, enough of this frivolity. I think it's time we got to something a bit more serious. So, you know, when you get to my age, I almost said don't bother, but anyway, you find you get rather more existential about things. And I would like to paint a broad sort of picture, which you can either agree with or disagree with. And perhaps if you disagree with it, that would even be better, because that way we'd have more debate. Let's start with a few aphorisms to get us going. The first of these from Augustus Caesar, who said the more complex a problem is, the simpler the solution should be. Now, we don't know whether he was joking, whether he was being cynical, or whether he really meant it, but at least he said it. However, you might contrast that with what H.L. Mencken, the American journalist, said, which was, for every complex problem, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. He also, by the way, said, a professor must have a theory as a dog must have fleas. You might bear that in mind for the rest of the talk. But really that which resonates most in this day and age, I think, is probably this one here from Thomas Stearns Eliot's first stanza of the first book of the four quartets, Humankind Cannot Bear Very Much Reality. Well, how true in the post-truth era. Can I say that, or am I tying myself in knots? But anyway, humankind cannot bear very much reality. I wonder sometimes whether we're not reaching the end of the second age of enlightenment. Reading Richard Watmore's recently published History of the End of the First Age, in other words, the second half of the 18th century, the parallels are so strong, it is unnerving. At the same time, we are perhaps moving into the age of artificial intelligence. And what does that mean? What does it tell us? What does it signify? Well, artificial intelligence has its uses, and I don't want to be too much of a Luddite. You know what the Luddites are. They were those who protested by smashing the machines against the automation of the textile industry in the north of England. And actually, if you really read up on them, they were a lot more than that. They were a prototype of the social security system. But anyway, it's artificial intelligence. Henry Forantelli, I knew him quite well. He was quite a simple man. He had a great love of London, by the way. But anyway, in an extremely prophetic article of 1997, he wrote, technology leads a double life, that which its makers intended and that which they did not intend. We have seen since about 2008 the inversion of social media from something benign to something much darker than what we thought we had in those early days. One of the problems with artificial unintelligence, AU, is although it has its uses, and some of those might be absolutely fundamental, although we have to adjust to it, there is a whole series of things that it is doing that are problematic with it. And that somehow we have got to grips with, but we have not done so. I won't read them out, but there you are. These are things we really need to think about. The techno fix is a very suspect idea, especially in disaster risk reduction. So I would argue with all of that and more that it is not business as usual. I've been doing evaluative work academically, in other words, looking at papers, grant proposals, and so on. So much of that work is just the same as it would have been 30 years ago. It's business as usual in the academic field, but it is not in the so-called real world. And that I find worrying. How are we going to adapt our field to what is actually going on out there? And in fact, Mami Mitsutori, when she was the head of UNDRR, wrote on page 6 of the midterm report on the Sendai framework for DRR that progress has stalled and in some cases reversed, which indeed is a really serious setback. Relatively few countries are following the Sendai framework. Some are paying lip service to them, but despite that, there's a whole series of things here that we see listed here that are problematic with the whole business. Short-termism, the weakening, the constant weakening of multilateralism. Inequality began to rise around 1970 to 1973 and has risen ever more steeply ever since. More than half of the world's disposable wealth, something of the order of $7 to $8 trillion, nobody knows exactly, is salted away in the world's 87 tax havens, and incidentally, the United Kingdom is responsible for 12 of the most successful ones. Interesting point. And of course, we have a major new challenge of just how are we going to get science across to the skeptics? And that is something I don't have the answer to. Indeed, I think you might find by the end of this, I don't have any answers, but maybe at least I've got the questions. COVID-19 has been the most complex and pervasive disaster since the Second World War. And I would argue that we're still in the middle of it. Okay, we're not sick, we're not ill, but pandemics are two things simultaneously. They are a medical emergency and they are a socio-economic emergency. The latter has mutated, as indeed has the virus, but it has not in any way gone away. I think, however, that it's going to take us up to 3 decades before we can really see what the effect of COVID is, especially in the so-called post-COVID period, which is now. And one reason for thinking that is that if you look at the influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1920, 18 months in Europe, 24 months in the whole world, the period after it was a very interesting period in which a number of things changed dramatically. I read a book called Vortex recently, which was a history of the Weimar Republic. And some of that, this was a very unstable political situation, and some of that stemmed directly from the influenza pandemic, which also, some have argued, perhaps wrongly, stopped the First World War. But it is clear that more soldiers were dying of influenza than were dying of enemy action. Something to think about. I come to the conclusion eventually that disasters are fundamentally caused by ideology. Now, if you want an example of that, look at the Texas floods of the 4th of July this year, 135 dead. And if you look at that, what you'll find is that conscious decisions were taken not to institute a warning system, not to look at the state of the weather, not to move campsites out of the flash flood hazard area, which was well known, and all of this in the country that has potentially more access to the means of stopping disaster than any other on earth. Ideology. So if we are in the age of neoliberal extremism, where are we going? Towards self-interest and individualism, or towards the solidarity that comes from collective action? Where are we on that continuum? So really, one of the problems with interpreting disaster is something that is fascinating because it opens a window on the inner workings of society. That really is fascinating. But what does it mean? Very difficult to tell in a time of considerable upheaval and change. But these are some of the things that we need to take into account. Climate change, for example, is very much a function of all the rest of it, rather than of any simple physical mechanism. And so I would argue, one of the things I would argue is that we need to look a lot more at the context of disaster. I'll try and define context shortly and anon. So we're living in a world of alternative realities, so-called. Now that is a euphemism, of course, for untruths in many respects. How do we deal with it? Well, Abraham Maslow produced his Pyramid of Fundamental Human Needs in 1942. I have added a layer to it, which is a layer of connection. Such is the upheaval, the change in society, that we need connection. We survive on it. Our transactions, whether they be social or commercial or whatever they are, require connection. And perhaps we can look at what happens to connection in disaster as well. More about that later. But the problem we have there is that we're dealing with something that I would call manufactured reality. That is to say, it isn't real reality, and yet it is at the same time, paradoxically, because if enough people believe something, then it is fatal to ignore it. We've got to do something about it, whether or not it's true. For example, if we all believe that vaccinating people is wrong and it's dangerous and so on and so forth, when science shows quite conclusively that it isn't, we've still got to deal with that. We haven't got to deal with whether vaccination is good or bad. We've got to deal with what people's attitude is to it, given that for vaccination we require herd immunity, meaning enough people vaccinated, which often is of the order of 95%, to obtain full herd immunity. Marshall McLuhan in 1964 wrote, "The medium is the message." Curiously, he changed that to "the medium is the massage" in later works, and perhaps you can work out what he meant by that. But nowadays, we might say it's the conspiracy theory or the so-called alternative fact. In other words, we're in an age of semiotics, an age of forms of communication in which we still have to adapt ourselves to something which in many respects has foxed us. It is new, it is different, it is hard to deal with and interpret. So the central question there is, what is the value of good, hard scientific information when we're dealing with an age of extremism, of relativism, and of a lack of clear morality? I think Chomsky has articulated that for decades very well indeed. Do we really want a world in which our leaders are criminals, delinquents, kleptocrats, and liars? Our heroes are vacuous celebrities, our manipulators are billionaires, our information is fantasy and falsehood, our ideology is toxic, our democracies are hollowed out. Let's remember that full democracy 10, 15 years ago was present in 29 countries, and the number is falling fast. It's now 24 or fewer. And a world in which our fellow human beings would rather look at a small screen than at us. And of course, the environmental question. What does it mean for resilience? Resilience, yes. Let's just define it in the simplest possible terms. There are at least 200 definitions of resilience, although it's very hard to see how they could possibly be different from each other. But nevertheless, in the simplest possible ways, large negative effects, the ability to overcome the risk and the presence of such events by a combination of resisting them, sometimes called hardening in certain circumstances, and adapting to them. Okay, I would argue, however, that in certain ways resilience is an illusion. Well, I don't want to be unkind or unfair to people who work in the field of resilience. Please carry on your work. It's absolutely essential. We absolutely and utterly need it. The reason why I say it's an illusion is because it does rely, if you look at the models of it and so on the concept of homeostasis. That is to say that the system which is disturbed, has not been resilient, will tend towards an equilibrium. It might be the past equilibrium or a new system state with an equilibrium in it. And my problem here is that I don't think at the moment that we've got an equilibrium in disaster risk reduction. Instead, we've got steep and rocky trends in it. Therefore, it is very difficult to tend towards an equilibrium. Now, when we started out, well, we've been going as disaster students for about 108 years. I think the Big Bang was the Halifax ship explosion in the harbour in Nova Scotia on the 6th of December 1917. I was there on the 100th anniversary of it, and that set off social studies of disaster, if not more than that. But by the 1950s, people had taken on board the work of the Nobel Prize-winning economist Herbert Simon, who tended to view people as the economic man, homo economicus. It's interesting he wasn't the economic woman. And maybe if he'd thought that, he would have had very radically different ideas. So maybe that would have been a lot better. But anyway, the economic man either optimized, he sought out all the solutions and chose the best, or he sought out a few of them and chose one of those, the satisficer. And yet all of that really has gone out the window, perhaps justifiably, perhaps that's a good thing. The question is what has replaced it? And that is where we perhaps have some issues. Now, you might argue that security and resilience have no intrinsic value. That, however, does mean that they have an enormous value in terms of what they protect, that does have intrinsic value. And that is parallel to the paradox of vulnerability. Vulnerability doesn't exist, but despite that, it is no less real. It's like friction. If you have a body on a surface that is not moving, there is no friction. If you move it, friction occurs. And one of the troubles with measuring both resilience and vulnerability, which we absolutely need to do, is that we're dealing with a bit of a phantasm, a bit of an elusive quality that somehow we have to pin down. Very difficult to do. So if we are to make progress, in my view, we need to look at four things: complexity, cascades, context, and foresight. Okay, start with complexity. Well, it's clear that in the modern world, disasters are complex. We live in networked societies, and therefore effects will propagate, and very seriously so. I don't need to cite examples of this. They're all around us, and they're in today's news, yesterday's news, and will be in tomorrow's news as well. So these are some of the things I'd like to consider forthwith. For example, what about misuse of the internet and social media? Well, in saying misuse, I'm applying my own value judgment to that. Others might not regard it as misuse, but nevertheless, we're in an interesting transition here from direct action, for example, to shut things down, of which nevertheless there is still a great deal, moving towards forms of influence and extremism, which instead pump things up, but not the things that necessarily help us collectively to manage disaster. So digital authoritarianism and digital extremism, there has been debate about whether these will overtake or supplant the kind of sabotage that we get as well, or whether that in fact will not occur. And that leads us to the concept of anomie, which is an old French word that Émile Durkheim, in his book On Labour in 1893 resurrected. And what he meant by it was a situation in which there is an abandonment of standards, moral values, ethics, and so on, which will then lead to a lack of purpose because of a lack of ideals, a lack of focus, a form of nihilism. Nihilism isn't all bad. There are people who are very principled about it once on a time, whether or not one agrees with it. But anyway, anomie is probably not a good thing at all because it would lead to a lack of disaster governance, which I suspect is what we are seeing in what Marmi Vittori regarded as things stalling or going backwards. We also, of course, need to look at how cascades propagate, and as we all know, they propagate very often through critical infrastructure. The spontaneous collapse of this bridge, for example, caused all sorts of problems connected with getting to school, for example, or delivering parcels and other goods, all manner of stuff. And that's just a tiny example. So really, in many instances, critical infrastructure is the main vehicle by which disasters produce cascading impacts. In January, in the Republic of Ireland, Storm Elvin cut off electricity to 778,000 customers. I've been working with the Irish government on the report on that because they're very keen to find out what the consequences are and what to do about them when this happens again in the future. But if you want to understand critical infrastructure, you've got to look not merely at the technical side of it, in other words, what breaks physically, but also at the other dimensions of it, the cyberspace dimension, especially given the so-called cyber war that we are enduring, apparently, so it is said, at least it is a costly situation, the social component, and the physical space in which all of this happens. An example, in Wajima in Japan, on the Noto Peninsula, I've been studying that a bit, and I've got a grant at present to do some fieldwork there. And in the January the 1st, 2024 earthquake there, it knocked out the bridges. There were 20,000 landslides onto the roads. There was a tsunami with 1.5 minutes warning. The port on one side of the peninsula was heaved up out of the water by 4.1 meters, on the other side inundated by the tsunami, which was caused by an undersea landslide. The weather was too bad for flights. The airport was out of action. Helicopter flights were difficult because of constant low cloud. And at least 58 people died simply because they froze to death being unrescued under the pancaked wreckage of their houses. Now, the Japanese would have rescued them most certainly under normal circumstances, but the cascading effects of this meant they couldn't do it. And since then, numerous problems of that kind. And of course, we also have the issue of warfare and its impact and so on. By the way, this picture here from Zillebeke in Belgium in 1970, this man here is one Ernest Richard Alexander, my grandfather. How do we cope with things like undersea warfare, for example? Good question. Well, these are things we need to plan for and understand, but in a way that is interconnected with the planning and understanding for other things, whatever they may be. If we have digital warfare, for example, we need to understand the mechanism and the structure of it, as well as endeavoring to find the solutions to it. One side against another. Not going to be easy. This is very much a preliminary diagram. It doesn't tell us much. Indeed, it tells us remarkably little. It's positively banal, but it might be the start of looking at something which then begins to intersect with other things. That brings us to intersectionality. Now, I've been very naughty, and I've borrowed the word from those who study culture, gender, and so on. I hope they don't mind too much. I mean something a bit different here. For example, intersection of the forms, the causes of disaster. Few disasters have a single cause. it's always a whole variety of things. If you look at, for example, the inquiry into the Grenfell Tower fire here in London, you'll find dozens, hundreds of potential avenues to explore with regard to the causes of it. We have intersection between different kinds of disaster. For example, during the height of COVID, we had 3 earthquakes, Croatia, Greece and Turkey and Japan. They required a very different response to COVID. You need to get really close to people during the earthquake and stay really far away from them during COVID. Disaster in its context, well, more about context in just a minute. And of course, disaster and social circumstances. But when you look at the ingredients of all of this, actually, in their current form, if we have a current form, given the mutations going on, many of these words have a history in their present form, which is less than 400 years old. So we can say that maybe 500 years ago, sovereignty, human rights, democracy, legality, mobility, identity, enlightenment, and so on, had quite a different meaning. And only recently, in human history, relatively speaking, have they gelled into what we now consider, which is a way of telling us that these things are not fixed. And in fact, because we're in the midst of a huge period of change, we might examine just how they are not fixed. Human rights are absolutely fundamental to disaster. If you have them, you can get information and you have the ability to act. If you haven't got them, you probably are not able to do any of that. Look at Myanmar, if you want an example. Look at Cyclone Nargis in 2008 and how that was managed and how there were enormous numbers of preventable deaths through the suppression of human rights, fundamentally. And in terms of context, for example, this is a picture of Bolton, next to Oldham in Lancashire, northwest England. Why did I choose that? Well, I noticed during COVID that decisions made in Westminster had more effect on these places, which are the poorest urban communities in the UK, than they did anywhere else. In other words, there is a magnification of the effect as a result of particular factors. What were they? Well, in this case, they were the number of occupants per room is a lot higher in Bolton and Oldham than it is in say, Esher in Surrey or somewhere like that. Many of the people who worked there worked in frontline jobs, nurses, delivery drivers, bus drivers, and so on, and were more susceptible to COVID. It's also interesting to note that the first 12 doctors to die of COVID in the UK were all ethnic minority doctors. There must be something behind that. Okay, context. I would define it as those things of various nature which don't directly control or even impinge directly upon disaster and its causes, but nevertheless are the setting in which disaster and the causes occur. We therefore really need to look at that setting because increasingly it comes to control what is going on. In other words, things that don't seem to have direct relevance probably do now increasingly. There are various forms of context, and here are some examples of them. Whether, however, we can categorize context in this way, I am not so sure. What we need to do very often is to provide scenarios of future disasters. More about that in a second. Okay, in so doing though, if we are to provide believable or reliable scenarios, we have got to combine things rather than dividing them up. Taxonomy, sometimes it helps, sometimes it gets in the way. So in the context of disaster risk reduction can be positive at the yellow end there, or it can be thoroughly negative. It can help us to reduce disaster. We can have a consensus, we can have powerful forces on our side, and we can work towards disaster risk reduction, or the opposite, or something in between. So I would argue that we need the Friday hypothesis. This is the silly version, it's followed by the sensible one. Okay, disaster, the yoke, is a combination of root causes, the underlying factors, dynamic pressures which bring them to the fore, the immediate triggers which set the thing off, and the vulnerabilities which are really the core and essence of disaster. But around that, we've got the context. It came to me in the middle of one night when I woke up thinking that you can't make people resilient against floods if they're not resilient generally. If they're sleeping under a bridge and have got no house or no employment, or they're very poor or whatever it may be, deprived, then it doesn't have much meaning to make them resilient against floods or whatever the raining hazard happens to be. So that's the more sensible version of it. And I know that recently there have been papers that have studied general vulnerability and placed specific vulnerability to particular hazards or threats within that. And that, I think, is something that we should be pursuing, because if we do that, then we can see the effect of general vulnerability upon specific vulnerability and learn more. Foresight. They didn't have it in Carlisle at the police station or the bus station, because all 57 buses were underwater as well. Anyway, we work in foresight in the grey area, which sits between things we know, determinism, where we can absolutely predict what's going to happen, things where we perhaps have a chance of being right, where we can be probabilistic about it and put numbers to it, and things where we are absolutely uncertain. The causal relationship, it might be known in vague terms, but certainly not in any very specific way. We work in the grey area. Why do we need, and what can we do with foresight? Well, there are many reasons why we need it. I had a long conversation with the Deputy Prime Minister of Japan about this. Protocol means that if he doesn't like you, he gives you 10 minutes. If he really likes you, he gives you half an hour. And I got 40 minutes, so I'm not complaining. And what were we talking about? Well, we started talking about the fact that if there is a magnitude 9 earthquake south of the one that occurred in 2011 on the Nankai Trough, and it does generate the expected 18-meter high tsunami, well, 60 million people live close to sea level between Tokyo and Kobe. Now, that's something that pure science can tell us things we absolutely need to know, but it can't solve the problem. We've got to work out how socially and organizationally to deal with that. And therefore, we need foresight to extend well beyond the physical parameters and variables. So we need to develop scenarios. Foresight, if it's practiced well, there are about 35 different methodologies for it. It's something that it isn't prediction, absolutely not. What it is, however, is the ability to produce a structured assessment of what might happen, including best case, worst case, medium case, whatever you like. I thank Gordon Wool, who is very kindly here tonight, for counterfactual analysis, very useful tool indeed in foresight. Upward, if things could have been better next time than last time. Downward, if they might be worse. Okay, so, well, in all of that, perhaps we need some kind of a solution, if I am capable of providing one, which I'm not. Let's be honest about it. But anyway, here's the model. Here's a model. And there we've got the causes of disaster laid out. And behind them is the context. And then we've got the cascading effects, which are panarchic in the sense that they travel at different geographical scales simultaneously. For example, if we take Grenfell Tower as a simple example, well, the direct cause was a short circuit in a refrigerator on the 4th floor. The indirect and long-term causes relate to the abandonment of building regulations and surveillance inspection. They relate to the use of unsuitable materials, largely for profit, and so on and so forth. The root causes, you might argue, are ideological. For example, a government that says for every rule that is enacted, 2 must be abolished. He didn't say which rules, whether they are fundamental and essential. Now, Trump did that in America for air traffic control, something you might think about where there used to be 14 air traffic controllers. I think it was Philadelphia, there are now 4. Anyway, let's hope none of them is sick. But when Grenfell Tower occurred, you had the local cascading effects. People had to be evacuated in the area. Then we had the London-wide effects where similar buildings had to be evacuated or placed under constant surveillance. Then we had the UK after the London-wide situation with something like 5,000 buildings. The figure varies enormously from one source to another, which were highly at risk of catching fire, and they were residential and tall. And that internationally connected with high-rise residential fires in Dubai, Australia, France, and Kazakhstan, among other places. Anarchy. So we have grand challenges. We have to adapt what we do, our research and our study, to changes in a very volatile world. Now that is difficult to do because as you adapt, things change. It sort of reminds me, if I may say so, that I went to a conference on the 12th of October, 2008, and a man stood up and said, my job is to tell you something you don't want to know and ask you to spend money you haven't got on something you don't think is going to happen. He then talked about a viral pandemic, the social, economic, psychological, behavioral, medical, virological, the whole lot in 45 minutes. So I started teaching it on the basis of his lecture. I adapted it and taught it for 12 years. In March 2017, I went to UCL school in Swiss Cottage because 12-year-olds were studying pandemics. And one said to me after my talk to them, you said it would take more than 6 months to make a vaccine. How could you be sure that the virus wouldn't mutate in that time so the vaccine didn't work? I said, well, you see, I had no idea. We soon found out, of course, but in summer, a 12-year-old said that. So anyway, we've got to develop a more rigorous methodology. I'm happy to say that JESIP, the Joint Emergency Services Interoperability Protocol, is now using my methodology. It only took them 20 years, as I published it in 2005, but at least it is now being used so that we have a more joined up form of emergency planning in the UK. And we need that all over the place. So lesson 1, countries need integral functioning civil protection systems. Okay, we need to reduce the risk of disaster, but when it happens, we can't not respond to it. We therefore need systems that are capable of doing that, and they will need to be an order of magnitude bigger than they are now. Secondly, we need to make this participatory and inclusive. Now, there's much talk, particularly in this country, about all of society approaches. What I don't see is all of society approaches. That's the problem. But somehow we've got to have it. We've got to take into account the needs, the concerns of women, girls, minorities, people with disabilities who normally are considered to be about 1 in 8 people in society, although a UK Parliament study suggested they're 1 in 4. Interesting. And yet they are routinely ignored. Lesson 3, disaster science needs a seat at the table because when you think about how COVID was managed in this country, it was managed largely, if not exclusively, by a mixture of doctors and politicians. And those with expertise in emergency planning, management, logistics, and all the rest of it were out of the loop largely. In lesson 4, we need a more powerful and effective way of combating information that is fundamentally wrong. We've got to do that. Quite how, though, is something we're just going to have to think about because I haven't got the answer. We do our best. We say, look, this is logical, this is correct, but are people believing us? Have we worked out a formula, a way to make this believable? So that is the end of the formal bit of this. Crusading was always a good thing, especially when it's done the wrong way around. I wonder, am I free at last, having become emeritus professor and so on? Hard to say, really. It's a lot to do. One thing I would like to do, though, finally, is to say a word about my influences. Just a quick word, and then one final reminiscence. The first of these is the book, The Autobiography of Giuliano di San Severo by Andrea Giovine. It's 5 times the length of a normal novel. It's quite remarkable book. He couldn't find a publisher for it, but when it got to Scandinavia, it was instantly translated into all 4 Nordic languages. And a committee was formed to try and get him the Nobel Prize for it. In my view, he should have won. I had the pleasure of meeting his niece at a disasters conference a few weeks ago, surprisingly. Secondly, Enrique Granados, whose death in the English Channel in an act of war was a really, truly great tragedy for someone whose music was essentially the crown jewels of Spanish national music. Thirdly, Edward Coley Burne-Jones. There is a relationship between the viewer and the canvas, which is hard to replicate in the work of other painters, perhaps in Gainsborough's pictures of his own family, or in some of the works of Guido Reni, but to be able to see into the minds of the people in the picture is really quite remarkable. Frederick Landseer Griggs, who was the master of atmosphere, perspective, and more. Carlo Levi, who was an anti-fascist, who later became a senator. He was a writer and a truly excellent painter. I never met him because he died shortly after I joined his circle of friends, sadly. But nevertheless, his book, Christ Stopped at Eboli, is one of the great classics of modern literature. And finally, those who directly affected me. Now, there are women, I've only put them in there, and I suppose it's a question of identity or something, but you'll just have to forgive me. John Bale on the left there was very kind to me in his autobiography. John Thorns, the second from the left, who was professor at LSE, later Bristol and later King's College London, was a person with more integrity than almost anyone else I've met. He was a totally committed scientist and a motivator, absolutely fantastically so. Rocco Mazzarone was firstly my mentor and later my close friend. Ian Davis is here tonight, and I'm very grateful to him for everything he's done for me. Gilbert White, a Quaker, the founder of, one of the founders of Disaster Geography, a very nice man and also very kind to me. But the only one who is now a statue is Rocco Mazzarone. As yet, the others are not in statue form, so far as I know. So finally, one last reminiscence concerns the time I took a flight from Nausori to Levuka in the South Pacific. They towed the plane in with a farm tractor. My ticket cost $9.50. I got in and realized that I was sitting in my seat with my knees in the small of the pilot's back. So I said to him, "Do you realize you have a flat tire?" He turned around and said with a thick New Zealand accent, no, mate, these are low profile tires. If they were fully blown up, we'd dig a trench in the runway." "Well, if you say so," I said. So we took off, boom, 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 and we reached our cruising altitude of 90 meters above sea level. And we crossed Motoriki and the atolls, and we landed at Levuka Airport, which was a field carved out of the island rainforest and a garden shed. I got out and he threw down my luggage, and I shouted at him, "Your left tire's blown up and your right one isn't." And my words were drowned out by the roar of the engine as he took off for the next island. So my colleague and I went to pay a courtesy call on the chief of police, who lived in a fairly normal looking house, although it had a banana shaped roof to shed the rain from tropical storms. And he said, "Come into the kitchen and have a cup of tea." Now, Melanesians, by and large, don't like to use furniture. They find it uncomfortable. So they have furniture because, it's very good, but they don't use it. So we sat down underneath the kitchen table. Now, we couldn't sit higher up than the chief of police. Protocol would not allow. His wife handed us down a cup of tea. We drank it. And then we went to pay a courtesy call on the chief of the Lao group of islands in the Longhouse. And that, of course, was a great deal of speech making, exchange of gifts, clapping and drinking kava. At intervals, there were pauses where we could stretch our legs, all sat there on the floor in the Longhouse. And during one of these pauses, one of the tribal elders said to us, you know, 100 years ago, we'd have eaten you. Now, some of you in the audience may be wishing that they had. So at that point, I think I better shut up. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, David. We've all been schooled. We've all learned so much, as always, and laughed along the way. Whether we've wanted to or not, you've made us laugh because we have to every time. Thank you to David for tonight, but even more thank you for your whole career and from all of us for everything we've learned from you. And we'll continue to read and learn from you in the future. Thank you, David.